In 1950, Venezuela boasted more wealth per person than Germany or Japan. Its capital was a beacon for hungry European migrants. Fast forward to 2018. The average citizen lost 24 pounds from hunger, and 7 million people fled a collapsing state. The world's largest oil reserves became a curse, not a blessing, fueling dependence, gutting industry, and hollowing the nation from within. This is how oil, once a golden ticket, set a trap that no one escaped. The story begins with a single catastrophic discovery. On December 14, 1922, a well drilled by Royal Dutch Shell near Lake Maracaibo erupted with such force that oil shot 60 meters into the air, raining down for days. The Barroso No. 2 blowout revealed a deposit so vast that within a decade, Venezuela was transformed from a quiet agrarian outpost into the world's largest oil exporter. More than 100 foreign oil companies led by Shell, Standard Oil, and Gulf rushed to secure concessions under the rule of Juan Vicente Gomez. Contracts favored these multinationals, granting them generous terms in exchange for royalties and taxes that dwarfed what the government could collect from traditional sources. By the late 1920s, oil was not just another export, it was the lifeblood of the economy. Over 90% of Venezuela's exports came from crude. The flow of dollars into Caracas drove the value of the bolivar higher, making it harder for coffee, cacao, and other goods to compete abroad. But for the state, oil was a miracle. Instead of relying on customs duties or taxing struggling farmers and merchants, the government could now fund its entire budget from a handful of oil companies. By the 1940s, oil royalties and taxes typically covered 80 to 90% of central government income. Non-oil taxes shrank to a fiscal footnote. This new arrangement changed more than the budget. With oil paying the bills, the government no longer needed to bargain with taxpayers or justify spending. Decisions about roads, schools, and subsidies no longer depended on the ability or willingness of citizens to pay. The old social contract, taxation in exchange for representation, quietly faded. In its place stood a rentier state, flush with cash, but increasingly detached from the daily realities of its people. Oil did not just enrich Venezuela, it rewired the relationship between ruler and ruled, setting the stage for decades of dependency on a resource that for now seemed limitless. The rise of oil wealth in Venezuela came with a hidden cost that would take decades to reveal. As oil exports soared, the value of the bolivar climbed, making imported goods cheaper and more attractive than anything produced at home. Farmers who once grew coffee, cacao, and maize could not compete with food trucked in from abroad, paid for with oil dollars. By 1960, agriculture still made up about 12% of the country's gross domestic product, a significant share for a nation built on its rural backbone. But over the decades, oil's gravitational pull grew stronger. By 1998, agriculture's share had collapsed to just 4% of gross domestic product. Fields that once fed cities were abandoned, rural towns emptied out as workers moved to Caracas and Maracaibo in search of oil-funded jobs and urban comforts. Manufacturing never filled the gap. Oil money made it easier to buy finished goods from overseas than to build factories or invest in new technology. Every time oil prices rose, the country imported more cars, appliances, and even basic staples like rice and beans. Attempts to foster local industry were quickly overwhelmed by a strong currency and a flood of cheap imports. The economy became a one-note song: oil out, dollars in, everything else bought from somewhere else. Economists call this pattern Dutch disease, a name borrowed from the Netherlands example with natural gas. In Venezuela, it meant that the more oil the country produced, the less competitive its farms and factories became. The state's growing dependence on a single commodity locked the economy into a cycle of boom and bust. When oil prices were high, imports surged and non-oil sectors withered. When prices fell, there was nothing left to cushion the blow. By the end of the 20th century, Venezuela was producing more oil than ever, but almost nothing else. Food, machinery, medicine, even clothing, nearly all came from abroad. The country's prosperity rested on a single export: leaving it exposed to every swing in the global oil market. What had once been a diverse, if modest, economy was now a hollow shell, entirely at the mercy of oil. This dependence was not an accident, it was a structural trap. In 1943, Venezuela rewrote the rules of the oil game. The hydrocarbons law forced foreign oil companies to hand over half their profits to the state, a 50-50 split that became the envy of other oil-producing nations. Standard Oil and Shell lobbied fiercely against it, but Venezuela's reserves and low extraction costs gave it leverage that few others could match. Within a decade, the country's share of oil income soared, and foreign majors, while grumbling in boardrooms, kept drilling and exporting. The winds of resource nationalism swept further. In 1960, Venezuela joined with Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, and Kuwait to found OPEC. Oil Minister Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso pushed for collective bargaining power, aiming to control prices instead of leaving them to Western buyers. The message was clear: Venezuela would no longer be just a wellhead for foreign profit. Then came the global shock. In 1973, after the Arab-Israeli War, OPEC embargoed oil exports to the West. Prices on the world market quadrupled, almost overnight. For Venezuela, government revenues exploded, jumping from $2.3 billion in 1972 to over $10 billion by 1974. President Carlos Andrés Pérez launched La Gran Venezuela, promising highways, universities, and housing for all. New ministries and state companies sprang up, flush with oil dollars. Public employment soared. A government job became the surest path to the middle class. In 1976, the state completed its takeover. All foreign oil assets were folded into Petróleos de Venezuela S.A., pronounced UPDVSA. The National Oil Company kept much of its technical staff, but answered now to the President and Congress, not to distant shareholders. Oil exports, once the domain of Shell and Gulf, now flowed through a state-owned giant. Every barrel sold meant more cash for the treasury. The windfall changed daily life. Gasoline became so cheap that it cost less than a bottle of water, often just a few cents per gallon. Electricity and other utilities were heavily subsidized. The state paid for food imports, public transport, and even concert tickets. Universal subsidies became an expectation, not a privilege. The logic was simple: as long as oil flowed, the government could afford anything. But almost none of this money went into building new industries or modernizing agriculture. Imports soared, and the economy became even more tightly chained to oil. The promise was that the boom would last. The reality was that every dollar spent on subsidies and consumption deepened the country's dependence on a single volatile commodity. In 1986, the price of oil plunged below $15 a barrel, slashing Venezuela's income almost overnight. Decades of spending left the country with little in reserve. Debt piled up, and the government turned to the International Monetary Fund, IMF, for a bailout. The IMF's conditions were clear: end subsidies, raise prices, and cut public spending. For a nation used to cheap fuel, free electricity, and imported goods, the shock was immediate and brutal. On February 27, 1989, bus fares in Caracas jumped by 30%. Commuters from the hillside barrios erupted in protest, blocking roads and setting vehicles on fire. Within hours, riots spread across the city and into other towns. Supermarkets and appliance stores were looted. The government declared a state of emergency and sent in the military. Soldiers fired live rounds at crowds, stormed homes, and patrolled the streets with orders to restore order at any cost. The official death toll was set at 276, but human rights groups and later investigations documented mass graves and disappearances, concluding the real number was in the hundreds, possibly over 1,000. Thousands more were injured or arrested. In the poorest neighborhoods, families mourned loved ones who never returned. The Caracazo, as it became known, left a scar that would not heal. The violence shattered faith in the old political parties, Acción Democrática and COPEI, who had promised prosperity but delivered only crisis. Ordinary Venezuelans saw a government that could not protect them from hunger or violence, yet still demanded sacrifice when the oil money ran out. When prices rebounded in the early 1990s, leaders rushed back to spending, ignoring the warning. The lesson of the Caracazo, that a country built on oil and imports had no cushion against a bust, was buried along with the dead. The door was now open for those who promised something different. Poverty in Venezuela tumbled from roughly half the population to just under a third in a few short years. Oil prices soared above $100 a barrel, and the Bolivarian missions rolled out across the country. Mission Robinson launched a massive literacy drive, enrolling over 1 million adults using a Cuban teaching method. Government clinics appeared in poor neighborhoods, staffed by thousands of Cuban doctors. Food distribution programs offered subsidized staples in barrios that had long been ignored. For many families, these gains were real: a first chance at reading, a doctor nearby, a refrigerator stocked with basics. Official data and UN regional surveys confirmed that by the late 2000s, income poverty hovered around 30%, a sharp drop from the late 1990s. But every new benefit depended on oil prices staying high and on PDVSA's cash. The state oil company became the engine of social spending, sending billions directly to off-budget funds and missions. Behind the scenes, the company's technical backbone was about to snap. In December 2002, a nationwide strike swept through PDVSA. Managers, engineers, and operators joined the protest, halting production and exports. The government responded with mass firings. In the months that followed, some 20,000 workers, nearly half the company's staff, were dismissed. Many were senior engineers and technical experts who had kept the complex machinery running for decades. Their replacements were chosen for loyalty, not for skills. The loss of institutional memory was immediate and irreversible. At the surface, oil kept flowing. In 2008, Venezuela's crude production reached a peak of 3.2 million barrels per day. But the cracks had already formed. Maintenance schedules slipped, spare parts ran short, and accidents became more common. Investment in new fields and equipment slowed as more of the company's budget went to social projects. Engineers who once oversaw refinery upgrades or drilling campaigns left the country, taking decades of experience with them. The number of workers on the payroll ballooned, but the expertise to keep operations safe and efficient drained away. Output soon began to fall, even as prices stayed high. The world's largest oil reserves were now managed by a company stripped of its technical core, tasked with doing more than ever, but with fewer of the people who knew how. The hollowing out of PDVSA would not be felt overnight, but the consequences were already set in motion. The collapse of Venezuela's currency began as a slow drip and ended as a tidal wave. In 2015, inflation crossed 50%. By the next year, it had jumped to 270%, enough to make everyday prices double every few months. In 2017, official figures lost all meaning as inflation soared past 800%. By 2018, the International Monetary Fund estimated prices had risen by nearly 1,000,000% in a single year. Banknotes became worthless faster than they could be printed. Salaries shrank to the price of a loaf of bread. People lined up for hours, only to find empty shelves. Supermarkets replaced cash registers with calculators, then with scales, then with nothing at all. Food vanished first. Price controls meant to keep staples affordable made it impossible for farmers and shopkeepers to cover their costs. Production collapsed. Imported goods dried up as foreign reserves ran out and creditors circled. With nothing left to buy, families skipped meals, then entire days of eating. The National Nutrition Survey run by Venezuelan universities found that between 2015 and 2018, the average adult lost 24 pounds. 8 out of 10 households reported food insecurity. Parents went hungry so their children could eat, but even children wasted away. Hospitals filled with cases of severe malnutrition. Clinics reported stunted growth, underweight newborns, and a generation marked by hunger. The healthcare system, already battered, could no longer respond. Medicine imports dried up. Doctors performed surgery without anesthesia. Vaccines ran out. Diseases like malaria and diphtheria, once controlled, returned. Infant mortality jumped by 30% in a single year. The humanitarian toll was measured in hundreds of thousands of excess deaths, many of which could have been prevented with basic supplies or functioning clinics. As hope faded, the country emptied. By 2019, more than 7 million Venezuelans, about a quarter of the population, had fled, according to the United Nations. The first to leave were doctors, engineers, and teachers, carrying their skills to Colombia, Peru, Brazil, or wherever they could find work. Later came families on foot, crossing borders with what they could carry. The scale of the exodus rivaled the world's largest refugee crises. A nation that once drew immigrants from Europe now saw its own people scattered across a continent, searching for food, medicine, and a future. The oil that once promised endless wealth had trapped Venezuela in a cycle of collapse, hunger, and flight. Today, Venezuela's oil reserves remain the world's largest, yet its economy and institutions are shattered. Resource wealth without accountability breeds fragility, not strength. This is visible from Caracas to Lagos. As global demand for oil shifts and new resource booms emerge, Venezuela stands as proof that abundance alone guarantees nothing. The true danger is not scarcity, but the illusion that riches make a nation unbreakable.